massive Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was one of World War II's most capable fighters. But it's often overshadowed in history by its glamorous Army Air Forces stablemates, the P-38 Lightning and the P-51 Mustang. With the squat, barrel-chested lines of a champion wrestler, this heaviest of all American wartime single-engine fighters was no glamour boy. But it had withering firepower with 8 50 caliber machine guns. Its rugged construction allowed it to withstand battle damage which could easily knock down other aircraft. By the time the war ended, 15,683 Thunderbolts had been manufactured by Republic on Long Island and at Evansville, Indiana. More than any single American fighter in history, yet less than half a dozen fly today. I'm delighted to welcome you to another Roaring Glory Warbirds program as I take you along to fly Republic Aviation's most famous product, the P-47 Thunderbolt. This is a big airplane. As you'll see when we walk around on a pre-flight, it was designed to be lethal to the enemy and kind to the pilot. Just look at how wide that landing gear is. When I first flew the 47, I was astounded at how easy it was to land, but those details we'll discover later when we fly. World War II airplanes were made to be shot at and shot up. That's part of the reason they continue to fly today, even though their original finite lives were measured in hours, seldom more than 50 in combat. The Thunderbolt, which weighed in at a basic combat weight of 7 to 9 tons, is the personification of that rugged nature. With a thin airfoil and a streamlined shape, the P-47's elliptical wing is ideal at high speed and in a dive. Surprisingly, this 400-mile-an-hour plus fighter was not a revolutionary design. It was evolutionary, coming from the early 30s Alexander de Seversky Michael Greger designs, which resulted in the P-35. Greger's airfoil, built into Seversky's semi-elliptical shape, was exploited by succeeding company engineers Alex Kartveli and Gus Pappas, making the P-47 one of the few aircraft that would approach the speed of sound in a dive. The heart of the P-47's firepower is its 8 50 caliber machine guns. These were very deadly, quite effective. Air-to-air, shooting down other airplanes, and air-to-ground, strafing. Of course, it also carried bombs and rockets. The airplane is so large, this massive landing gear had to be designed in such a way that it'd be long enough so the propeller would clear the ground and short enough to go in the well. The way that works is there's a telescoping feature in the strut. So as it goes up into the wing, it actually shrinks the size of the strut, pops up into the wing. This is where the engine exhaust comes out when it's not routed back to the turbo supercharger in the tail. There's a wastegate up here that varies the amount of power that goes through the turbo. This is the oil cooler exit door. This has an electric motor that opens and shuts this tiny door to vary the amount of air that goes in and out of the cooler. These are the cowl flaps, and they control the amount of air that goes through the engine cylinders. They're open here at maximum for maximum cooling, and then at altitude they're normally shut because you have plenty of air coming through the engine. The oval shape of the cowling is due to this supercharger intercooler intake. That's what this air does. It goes right down here to the intercooler, which sits below the Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine. That's 2,800 cubic inches, producing about 2,000 horsepower. Pulled along by a 13-foot diameter Hamilton standard propeller. You have to absorb an awful lot of power with these blades, and that's why it's so large. The Thunderbolt's fuel tanks are located in the fuselage. The main tank is at the front, 270 gallons, just ahead of the windscreen. The auxiliary tank is here at the wing root, 100 gallons. They're both under detachable covers. Under that are the fuel filler necks. The drains for these tanks are located down here at the base of the wing root, a very convenient location for a World War II fighter. Quite unusual. Drain the main here, the auxiliary here, and the gascolator screen here. A very nice setup indeed. The air that comes in the bottom of the cowling to go to the intercooler has to come out somewhere. This is the intercooler exit door. The air runs through the intercooler, cools the air off, and comes out here. This is operated from the cockpit by an electric motor. So the pilot keeps track of what he needs to do inside the cockpit and opens and shuts the door accordingly. The first Thunderbolts had fabric-covered control surfaces, rudder, ailerons, elevators. But the airplane was so fast, particularly in a dive, it tended to shed the cloth off these surfaces, and of course the airplane went out of control. So very quickly they replaced them with metal, and all production aircraft had metal-covered control surfaces, which says a lot about its high-speed capability. According to Army Air Force's statistical summaries done after the war, fighter groups flying the P-47 accounted for the destruction of 3,916 enemy aircraft, 88,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 tanks and armored vehicles, and 68,000 trucks. Even though it was designed as a high-altitude interceptor, the 47 was ideal for ground attack work due to its tough airframe, air-cooled engine, and superb firepower. It could carry quite a load of bombs and rockets. This single aircraft was most responsible for moving George Patton and the Allied armies into Germany after D-Day. Pre-takeoff cockpit check. Trim tab controls. Rudder set to takeoff. Elevators in neutral. Aileron in neutral. Emergency hydraulic hand pump. Test for pressure. Move the flap lever up. See, the flaps are moving up. Landing gear control down. Intercooler doors closed. Oil cooler doors in neutral. Turbo control off. Throttle closed. Master battery switch off. Ignition switch off. Instruments checked and set. Cowl flaps are open. Primer closed and locked. Radios set and off. Tail wheel control unlocked. Now we're ready for start. Throttle at 1 inch. Prop control full forward. Mixture and idle cutoff. Air filter is required. Prime about 6 or 7 strokes for a warm engine. Propeller area clear. Battery switch on. Starter switch clear. Engage. Here go the propellers. 1, 2, 3, and start.
Prime, there she goes. She starts rumbling, feet in the mixture. And let off on the prime, it's running fine. And we've got oil pressure. Of course, the P-47 is a tailwheel airplane, so you have to S-turn it in order to see in front on taxiing. And the S-turn is absolutely critical because even with the large nose, it's worse with the cowl flaps open. Those large cowl flaps blank out another probably 1/8 of your view. So it's a constant S-turn, something totally unlike modern aircraft. And that always makes sure nobody's in front of you so that you don't hit them. The wide stance of the landing gear certainly helps. It's very stable, very easy to control, and no effort really. It's just a matter of tapping the brakes. There is no steerable tail wheel. It's a locking swivel tail wheel, so it's either fully locked or it's fully swiveling. Okay, we go out onto the runway, line up, lock the tail wheel. That's very important. Release the brakes. Now up to 30 inches, stabilize, and then slowly up to 52 inches maximum takeoff power, and it's very smooth. The airplane is effortless for takeoff. Level off, close the cowl flaps, reduce to a power setting of 32 inches and 2250 RPM for medium cruise. That gives us about 85 gallons an hour fuel consumption. Stability in flight is immediately obvious. And the machine's on rails. It really is very nice, very stable. That kind of stability is excellent for level flight and for dives, climbs. And of course, it's an excellent air-to-air gunnery platform as a result. The airplane stays exactly where you put it. And that's what you want for something with guns and bobs. With only the turbo supercharger to manage and look at, it's got a turbo RPM gauge. It's really quite simple in here. Once you get all these switches and dials and levers fixed up and get the steam shift cab organized, it's pretty good. The first surprise in the air is how very light this thing is on the controls. It is absolutely wonderful. Particularly compared to the P-51 and Spitfire and some other fighters, it's got terrific ailerons. Roll rate is better, and very, very light indeed. Now I can finally understand why this thing was such a good dogfighter. Even though other fighters could out-turn it, and that was the problem. You couldn't get in the turning fight with the Thunderbolt, because the Thunderbolt just wouldn't make it. Any other airplane will out-turn it, but it will outroll most everything else. Aerobatics are wonderful. Rolls, loops, rapid reversals. This is how a pilot can certainly win a dogfight. It doesn't tend to drop a wing or snap, and it also has a beautiful accelerated stall. You can pull real hard on it, and it will shudder, just like any airplane will. Then when it stalls, it just flushes. A little bit of forward stick, nose down, it flies right out of it. Beautiful. No trouble at all. Control harmony is excellent. It doesn't take any effort to keep the thing harmonized, coordinated with the ball in the center. As a result, pilots could manhandle this thing, and it would stay under control. Just any regime at all. Now, one thing you do have to watch for, low and slow, it will come down like a rock. As we'll see on landing, it's very critical you maintain 130 or more without turning the airplane. Now we're up at altitude. We'll roll over and go into a dive. And man, can this thing dive. In World War II, nudging the critical Mach near the speed of sound. Both were so clean that they could get away from their pilots and dives and were unrecoverable. Some guys went straight in. You couldn't pull the airplane out. The controls will lock up, get very stiff until they're immovable, and then the airplane just goes in. Dive flaps were installed on both aircraft, both the P-38 and the P-47. So all you do is throw the switch, it would pitch the nose of the airplane up, and it would recover. Emergency procedures are pretty straightforward. If you lose hydraulic pressure, you simply go to the hand pump and pump the gear or flaps down. Very reliable, very straightforward, not a problem to deal with. The real caution in the manual is fire. With a turbo supercharger in the rear of the airplane, if fuel started running down the belly into the turbo supercharger, of course that thing's really hot, it would catch fire, and there's no way you can put it out. So the only rule, if you catch fire, it says in the manual, is jump out. That's it. Don't try to put it out, don't dive it, don't do anything else. Just get out of the airplane if it's on fire. Sitting in something this big, one can see why the pilot was so well protected by the metal surrounding him. There's a huge engine up front, armor plate all over the place, an armor windscreen, big thick armor plate on the side of the fuselage. Of course, he was also a larger target. This is a bigger airplane than most single-engine fighters, for both anti-aircraft fire and enemy fighters. But with an air-cooled engine, loss rates for ground attack were much lower than for the liquid-cooled Mustang and the P-40. Just one bullet hole in the coolant in those airplanes and they went down. This, you could shoot it all kinds of places and it would still run. There are some guys who said they had cylinders shot off of the engine and could come back to the connecting rods going in and out of the cowling. But with all that hot air coming back from the 18 cylinders that are cooking along in front of you, needless to say, you've got about a 200-degree centigrade hot air blast coming back into the cockpit. In the summer, that is really tough. It heats it up enormously with this bubble canopy over your head. It even gets worse. Now, if you're going to altitude, that's great, because the airplane had a lousy heater. So the whole idea was you needed all that heated altitude. But low level on a summer day, particularly in the Pacific, it was not comfortable. It was kind of miserable. It's actually unbearably hot at low level and a real fatigue generator, actually. Okay, now let's go for home and go through the landing checklist. Come across the field, broken into the pattern, get the airplane slowed down a bit, fuel on the main or the fullest tank, mixture auto-rich, prop control back up to 2550 RPM, cowl flaps closed, tail wheel with double check is locked. Get our landing clearance, overhead approach at about 200 miles an hour, brake to the left, slow down below 200 because that's the gear speed, and we'll lower it a little bit more than that with these older airplanes. We don't want to push it. So we'll come down to about 170, lower the gear. Down she goes, and look for 3 green lights. 1, 2, and 3. We've got 3 green lights, everything's locked down. Flaps below 190. And the problem in World War II, and even now, is the flap compensator did not work, and so the flaps tend to go down on either side at different rates. Sometimes you'll get a flap up on one and a flap down on the other. That's not so good. So we lower a little bit of flap to slow it down, and then we go full flap when we're committed to avoid that problem and leave the flap lever down. In the pattern, we're at 150, now we're coming on base, down to 140. And the cautions manual do not make any turns below 130 miles an hour. The airplane tends to stall and it tends to sink at a very high rate if you go slower than that. So we're not going to go below 130 until we're on final. 140, now we're coming around on the final. Lead it down, we're on 130 full flaps. Good view over the nose. The nose pitches down with the flaps all the way down so we can get a good look at the runway ahead of us. And bring the speed down, slowly down on final, down to 125. Down to 120, down to 115. As we're coming across the numbers now, all the way to idle, pull the stick back at a 110 and she settles right on and bounces along with no effort at all. Steer. Now one of the great things it says in the manual is this aircraft has no tendency to swerve on landing. It does not have any tendency to swerve on landing. It goes straight as a freight train, and that's a wonderful feeling. Just a little bit of rudder here and there is all we need. Very, very nice indeed. Then comes the next piece of advice from the manual. Every effort should be made to land on the first quarter of the field. This airplane is heavy and requires considerable distance to stop rolling. Amen, brother. If you don't do that, the thing will roll all the way around the earth. I think the thing can eat up as much runway as the pilot can give it without getting on the brakes. So now we start to get on the brakes, pump them up, get it slowed down. There was an old saying, if someone built a runway around the world, Republic would build an airplane to use every bit of it. Well, I believe that. Even the jets were that way that Republic built. And here's where pilot discipline comes in. The envelope between going too slow and too fast on final is so narrow, you'd better nail it the first time. Either that or go around. Pilots can fly a Thunderbolt to its limits with no fear of getting in over their heads. That's probably the strong point of the airplane. It was one of the simplest to fly, one of the most gentle to fly, at the same time being extremely rugged, extremely powerful. That combination was very, very comforting. Rudder's very effective. Even right down to about 10 miles an hour, you can turn the thing with just rudder, even though the tail wheel does not steer.
After taxiing in, getting the adrenaline under control, bringing the power back, getting ready to shut down, pulling the mixture back now. Oh boy, listening to that massive propeller slowing down, the whirling sound is a magic thing in the P-47. Smelling the last bit of burn oil exhaust, it's wonderful. Without a doubt, the P-47 is no bucket of bolts. It handles better than most of its contemporaries, is docile in all regimes, is easy to fly, and overall is viceless. No wonder it was able to do so well in both air combat and ground support. A minimum of pilot training could make a Thunderbolt jockey. Certainly it has its drawbacks, particularly lack of range, at least until the P-47N. A P-47D could fly about 900 miles with external tanks. Both the P-38 and the P-51 could top 2,000 miles. Quite a difference. But lack of range didn't seem to stop Hub Zemke and the 56 Fighter Group from scoring more air-to-air kills than any single USAAF unit. I've come to regard the P-47 as one of my favorite fighters to fly. See you next time on another Roaring Glory. Today we'll pilot a P-47, fly across the French countryside into World War II Germany, through swarms of enemy fighters and raining anti-aircraft fire. From the warring skies over the Philippines, we'll plunge into the deadly waters of the Pacific, and you'll experience it all firsthand through the words of Gil Burns and Wally Montague, who were there. Welcome to the Young Pilots. With its capacity for absorbing incredible punishment, the P-47 is credited with saving many pilots across the globe during World War II. And though in England some American pilots were reluctant to transition from the nimble Spitfire to the 7.5-ton Thunderbolt, they soon realized they had a fighter with the range to penetrate enemy territory, where the action was. Today's mission isn't part of any famous battle or decisive moment of the war. School kids won't even bother memorizing the date. In fact, in the annals of history, it will be simply lived and forgotten, as if just another routine ride to work. But for a young pilot named Gil Burns, it will prove anything but routine. And he'll soon see that sometimes it takes something extra, beyond man or machine, to pull through.
Take your seats, gentlemen. Today's mission will be a ground attack area support mission.
February 23, 1945 began as a routine day at Toul Airstrip in France.
Take off, fly north.
The briefing dictated we would be flying a similar itinerary as the day before.
Any questions?
Since my plane, Ginny, was down for servicing, I was to fly another known simply as Tar Heel Hal. This day, our planes were armed with 6 4.5-inch rockets. They were fired by pushing a button on top of the stick, one rocket fired for each push of the button. The noise of the plane's engine, the closed cockpit, and the flying helmet with earphones all aided in muffling the sounds of the rockets being fired. What you could hear was only a pop-pop sound. I made a northwest to southeast pass, coming in somewhat slower and in a perfectly straight, ball-centered flight path. The plane was in a shallow glide, perhaps 300 feet per minute. My right thumb tensed on the release button, and in 2 or 3 seconds I said to myself, "Fire 1." At that precise second there was a pop, but the release button had not been pushed. Yet the sound was that of a rocket being fired. Again, a pop, and then a series of pops. The cockpit filled with smoke. I then realized that my P-47 was being hit by anti-aircraft fire. The sounds of the hits were exactly like the sounds of the rockets being fired. Assuming the plane was on fire, I reached for the canopy handle, yanked it, and the canopy rolled back. I disconnected the radio cable and oxygen hose. Then the seatbelt and shoulder harness straps were released. I threw myself out over the right side of the cockpit with head, shoulders, and arms hanging over the side of the fuselage. Looking down, I could see only one thing: trees. And they looked so close. I couldn't bail out. I was too low. Falling back into the cockpit, I grabbed the stick again and stared straight ahead. Smoke had cleared from the cockpit and the engine was still running. The throttle was advanced and I attempted to gain altitude. Pulling back on the stick showed it was now loose and lifeless. The rudder pedals were equally lifeless. With the stick jammed all the way back and with advanced throttle, the plane merely maintained level flight with no gain in altitude. I was too low to bail. It was then that the left wing slowly started to drop, and it was then that certainly a miracle from heaven occurred. As there was no stick aileron control, how could the wing be brought up? My left hand went to the aileron trim tab wheel. This move saved my life. 2 or 3 seconds more and the wing would have been too low to recover, and the plane would have rolled over and crashed. If the stick aileron's control was lost, you would assume the trim tab control would also be lost. But the left wing slowly came up. Turning the trim tab in the opposite direction then brought the right wing up after a few seconds' pause. It was not an instantaneous response, but rather a delayed reaction. To keep the plane level, the trim wheel had to be constantly twisted, one way and then the other. There had been so much structural damage the plane could not keep level flight by itself. If one wing fell off too low, recovery would have been impossible with a small trim tab surface. This would definitely result in a fatal crash as it was too low for bailing out. Two new problems now presented themselves. First, I was exposed to enemy anti-aircraft fire as the plane was flying low, alone, and crippled. This problem was quickly solved. While the rest of the squadron continued with the mission as planned, 3 members of my flight rejoined me in a 4-fingered spread battle formation. From the ground, the enemy wouldn't recognize me as the unfortunate exposed one. The second problem was that of direction. The rocket pass had been won to the southeast. This meant I was penetrating deeper behind enemy lines. Like flying for the first time, I now had to learn to turn the plane with just the trim, no stick or rudder pedals. I experimented by dipping the left wing just a little and then dipping the right wing somewhat more, back and forth, back and forth. After what seemed an eternity, the plane was eventually turned to the general direction of Toul. Both wingtips were in tatters. The rudder and elevators were shredded. Apparently both wheels had been hit and the rocket tubes blown off. On the interior, I had no radio, no rudder pedals, no ailerons, and perhaps just a touch of elevator left. To maintain level flight, I was constantly twisting the trim back and forth, doing the high wire act. I was too low to bail out, and if one wing should get away from me and drop too low, I was dead. I was now flying at 265 miles per hour with full throttle and just maintaining altitude. The plane was so damaged that the additional drag prevented any further acceleration. Not only that, if throttled back a little, buffeting would start at 255 miles per hour. This meant at best, I would stall my Thunderbolt at less than a speed of 250 miles per hour. Even if I could get back and line up with the runway on the approach, I would still have to hit the ground at an unfriendly 250 miles per hour. Several thoughts gave me hope to continue on. First was my previous crash landing in England. I'd survived that, and it was giving me the confidence to know I could crash again and survive. But I also knew in my heart it was going to take more than confidence to survive this time. Landing at 250 miles per hour with practically no flight control, it would have to be a miracle. My wingman radioed ahead my conditions and to have the field cleared for emergency landing with ambulance and fire apparatus handy. I was attempting to navigate by checkpoints that I had come to know, trying to come in straight and lined up with the runway. That was the important thing. Finally, I saw the airstrip up ahead, but to the right. I was not lined up. This meant circling around 25 to 50 miles to make another pass. My luck was running out. I went around to the right. Completing the circle, I saw the runway again. Crossing the boundary lines of the field, the ignition was switched off, the gas line shut off, and the seatbelt and shoulder straps had been tightened up previously. This was it. There was no going around again. I passed between the tower and the edge of the runway. The plane hit the ground at 250 miles per hour. At impact, my head bucked forward to within 1 inch of the steel gun sight. The plane bounced in the air and came down again. Once again, it bounced up. The plane hit, stayed down, and slid and slid. When it stopped near the end of the runway, I jumped out, saw the ambulance waiting, ran for 100 feet in case the plane blew up. I fell down and fainted.
Come on. Okay,
Come on. Laying down. Let's get those legs up there. Ready? Up.
Come on. Start. Go. Let's go.
When I came to, after checking and finding I had no physical wounds of any kind, the doc sat me down and took out a big, heavy French water glass.
You all right?
He kept pouring me whiskey and had me drink it.
This will calm your nerves. Don't tell the other boys I'll give you more. Yep, flying in no time. We'll have to get you back in here as soon as we can. Yep. I'll keep an eye on you.
About 10 minutes later, the colonel walked in with a camera and told me to come out to the wreck with him for a picture.
We're lucky. See, you feel like going out and getting a couple of pictures out by the plane before you pull it off the wing?
Yeah, sure.
What happened from that point on, I do not remember. The whiskey had taken over, so in all probability I was propped up more or less for the shots. Since I had not been injured physically in the crash, the doctor's treatment consisted of getting back in the air as soon as possible.
It glided like a flat iron and had an incredible thirst for fuel, but most who flew the P-47 had an enduring affection for it. On those long, lonely missions flying over enemy territory, it was a comfort to know their plane wouldn't let them down. They had plenty of other concerns racing through their minds, as our young pilot, Wally Montague, will soon discover.
It started about 1700 hours, January 7th, 1945. 4 of us took off from Tacloban airstrip on Leyte Island, Philippines. I was leading the flight to cover a large convoy of Navy ships until the regular Marine night fighters relieved us. The 200-mile trip was uneventful, but almost immediately upon arriving there, my wingman started bouncing his ship around as if he had palsy. I spotted 8 unidentified fighter planes. I peeled off towards the ships to get a closer look. My wingman stuck like glue to my tail, but my element leader, Tex, eased his element out to the right in perfect combat position. As we got closer, Tex confirmed that they were enemy planes. They hadn't spotted us yet, so I threw the throttle to the firewall, yanked the stick, and started clawing for more altitude. After climbing about 500 feet, we tightened formation and sat up there, waiting to see what the other ships had in mind. Meanwhile, Navy radar had picked up unidentified pips, and they were screaming for help from us. After about 3 minutes, Tex and I were pretty sure the Japs were out to attack the convoy. I switched to the Navy radio channel and broke silence. Navy CV, this is Sidecar. 8 bandits spotted at 1000 hours. Your position.
Sidecar, this is Navy CV. All ships alerted? Over.
Lay off the ACAC until we call for it. Over.
And will not open fire until necessary.
I switched back to intercom. Okay, Tex, let's get started. I'll make a pass, head on first. You follow close behind and make a side-on crossing pass. Keep it up as long as we can. Things went fast then. My wingman was careful to stick as closely as he could for the first 2 passes. We accounted for 3 planes before they could get organized. Then, the inevitable happened. The Japs have a strategy called decoying. One plane limps away, usually luring one of our more adventuresome pilots away from his protective combat formation. Immediately, he's pounced on. And that's all, brother. Well, my wingman got tangled into one of these tricks. I took out after him, but it was all over before I could help. The Jap was too near. They tangled wings. The last I saw were 2 parachutes mushrooming towards our friends, the Navy. One of them would have a royal welcome. Meanwhile, Tex and his wingman were having a heck of a time of it. I quickly headed for them, but suddenly my engine was spitting and coughing. My heart began to pound as I realized I had been hit too. With Junior gone and my engine coughing up oil, I sought out my Texas compatriot. Hey Tex, my wingman joined the Navy and I'm snafu. I'm heading back. Over.
Roger that. We'll catch you as soon as we finish here.
My engine kept sporadically belching fire and oil. Full throttle barely gave me 185 miles per hour, and a P-47 is pretty hard to maneuver below 200. For the next 15 minutes, my hands were full on trying to fly my ailing ship. It had grown dark and the flames from my engine were blinding me. Also, heavy oil deposits on my windshield kept me from seeing ahead. Bravado I didn't feel at all. I was right happy to see that shoreline almost beneath me, because I wasn't too afraid of bellying into the water should she stop flying. Just 10 minutes more, I thought. There's the strip. A Navy ship in the harbor picked me up in its sights. At least they know I'm up here. Just a few more minutes. I sat fascinated, watching the cherry red chunks of metal flipping end over end from my disintegrating engine. Snapping back to reality, I glanced at my instruments while unbuckling my safety belt. 2,000 feet, 175 mph, oil pressure 0, tachometer spinning like a top. Jumbled thoughts raced through my mind. Pull back the stick, roll on my back to fall out. Can't get it all the way over. I have to get out of here. Kick the stick to pop free. Remember to clear the tail. Ow! The parachute cushioned the blow, then intense silence, except for the wind. Ripcord free, and nothing happened. Clawing at my seat pack, the tiny pilot chute came free. I clamped my feet together and waited for the shock of impact. When it came, I felt my feet driving through my shoulders. From there on, everything is hazy. I ripped off my oxygen mask. It was a job for me to breathe. One lung had collapsed and the other wouldn't work. I pressed my hands back and forth into my abdomen. And that's how I was found. Semi-conscious, gasping for breath, and oblivious to my rescuer's calls.
Neck injury and possible referral.
Unfortunately, not everyone walks away from a crash. Not everyone's so lucky. But that's not what pilot Wally Montague is thinking. He considers himself the luckiest man alive. They thought about being wounded. Some even fashioned pre-tied tourniquets around their arms and legs in case they were severely wounded. They thought about being captured. Pilots heard stories about angry Germans tying down flyers to horses and dragging them through the streets to be stoned and beaten. And of course, they worried about being killed and having to kill. As Wally Montague discovered, luck was often as important a factor as the rugged jug itself in the survival of the young pilots. Like Gil Burns, who crash-landed and walked away without a scratch, it was usually a combination of providence and the durability of the P-47. Of the 15,683 Thunderbolts manufactured, only a handful survived to fly after the war. Today, about 4 are flying at any one time, with another 4 to 6 in restoration. See you next time for more exciting true stories of the young pilots.